A war criminal, a murderer, a dictator. He came to power as a result of conspiracy.
Putin was not a figure in his own right.
But he began to reshape the country to fit his plans.
Putin is still clinging to power. And in fact, he has already become a completely isolated dictator on the international stage.
In the 19th century, a group of scientists experimented with frogs, and it turned out that if a reptile is thrown into hot water, it jumps out of it immediately. If you heat the water gradually, the frog will not feel the danger and will boil. This phenomenon is now called the boiling frog syndrome and is often used as a confirmation that people are poorly responsive to gradual changes that are life-threatening. This is what happened to Russians at the dawn of Putin's regime. They were deprived of the ability to rationally assess the situation by means of intimidation, for example by creating an external threat. And after that, legislation was slowly tightened and the population did not notice how it was trapped in the repressive machine of the dictatorship. How the regime was built and how they are trying to settle it completely now, learn in the special report Putin's life imprisonment, how the Russians were robbed of their choice.
Украли выбор.
For most countries of the world, presidential elections are an intrigue. What will be the candidates? What programs will they run with? What course will they choose? And of course, how the citizens will vote. But Russia is not on this list. After all, 5 months before the elections, the candidate, the winner, and even the result are already known.
Our presidential election is not really a democracy, it's bureaucracy. Putin will be re-elected next year with over 19% of the vote.
After this statement, Putin's spokesman had to justify himself to his own propagandists, saying he was misunderstood by foreign journalists and he was talking about the consolidation of society. And this is not surprising because before the elections, it is very important for Putin's regime to give the population a sense of choice, as well as a sense of prosperity and greatness of the country. And what Russians are told to be proud of is already the first exhibition of achievement since Soviet times. More than $53 million was spent on it, and it became the unspoken start of Putin's election campaign.
When the achievements are obvious, everyone sees. People feel it in their own way, in their wallet. Then in this situation, of course, you can't do without an exhibition. But if people do not feel the achievement, then it's necessary to make an exhibition and convince people.
But despite the Kremlin's dreams of nationwide love, only 30% of Russians are ready to support Putin. This is the data of the independent research group Russian Field. Therefore, the Kremlin plays on herd mentality. Just entertainers are already urging Putin to ballot.
There is a wish to say thank you so much for everything you do for our country.
The people ask him to stay and the Tsar graciously agrees. This is not the first time the Kremlin has used this technology. It was the same in 2003 when Putin was running for his second term. Then Valentina from Krasnodar asked Putin to ballot during a so-called direct line. Will you run for a second term?
I plan to do this in the coming days. And I know that there are so many questions, so yes, I will run.
Putin was promoted to a third term after the changeover by his successor Dmitry Medvedev.
I believe it would be right if the Congress support leader Vladimir Putin's candidacy for president.
An employee of a car factory in Nizhny Novgorod begged Putin for a fourth term, saying that it would be such a gift to the people. Putin sympathized and agreed.
So give us a present, announce your decision. I will be running for president of the Russian Federation.
This time, Kremlin political technologists have started feeding people with rumors about when the dictator will announce his intention to run for office. But the date itself is not so important. They are playing with emotions. The Kremlin understands perfectly well that Russians are not eager to vote for Putin and that his announcement will be perceived negatively. This is why they are preparing people for the inevitable.
Therefore, there will be a powerful wave of disappointment. And in this sense, it's better to make it not to impose on the campaign itself, so that by the time the campaign officially kicks off, by the time it's officially launched, it will be like we already knew that he would go.
It is also up to the Kremlin to decide who will run as Putin's approved competitor. The main feature is age. They must be older than Putin, so the dictator will not look like an old man. And the desire of Russians to vote for someone younger will disappear.
The Russians can't claim Putin directly. They can say you're a usurper, a tyrant, a dictator, but it's scary, it's a crime, and you can go to jail for it. But you want to make a claim, and in this sense, age is becoming an outlet where Russians can rush in. And so they are trying to curb this problem, which is very dangerous. And so they try to create such a context that they say nothing special, everything is fine, and in the hope that it will not be obvious.
Kremlin casting is already in full swing. The former head of the Yabloko party, Grigory Yavlinsky, was recently seen in the Kremlin. He's age-appropriate and his rating is 0. In the 2018 elections, he barely garnered 1% of the vote. The Kremlin is also counting on familiar candidates Gennady Zyuganov and Leonid Slutsky. But Putin needs not only older candidates but also the youth. The Kremlin is raising new voters for the dictator. Schools organize unified lessons on elections. Officially, they are dedicated to the 30th anniversary of the Central Election Commission. In reality, future voters are taught to love Putin and trust the election results unconditionally. They even offer students to organize elections themselves.
My class and I tried to run an election, but it didn't quite work out.
And no wonder, because in Russia only Putin has the right to be elected. After decades on the throne, power has become a habit for the internationally recognized dictator, and it is also a guarantee of his security. He fears that when he loses power, the Russians won't forgive him for at least 300,000 killed soldiers in the war for his personal ambitions, and the threat of facing a tribunal in The Hague adds to the motivation to hold the throne. For many Russians, Putin's presidency looks like an unchangeable constant. As death is inevitable for every person, so is inevitable Putin's presidency for Russians, but his accession to power in 2000 was an ordinary deal.
I am resigning. I have signed a decree on assigning the duties of the President of Russia to the chairman of the government, Putin.
This is how, in the last minutes of the passing millennium, Russian President Boris Yeltsin actually appointed a new leader for Russians. And while ordinary Russians were shown a picture of the outgoing government handing over the reins of power to the new regime, intrigues were simmering behind the walls.
One should understand that Yeltsin was practically incapacitated by the end of 2000, and under no circumstances could he go to the next presidential campaign. If he had been healthy, believe me, they would have come up with some constitutional change or something like that. He would have stayed in power.
Therefore, the family, as they called both relatives and oligarchs close to then President Boris Yeltsin, was looking for a successor. There were many requirements for the candidate. He had to hate the communists to make it impossible for them to return to power, be a liberal, and above all, to guarantee both Yeltsin and his family inviolability. No criminal charges, no deprivation of property.
I can absolutely say that there was panic in Yeltsin's surroundings. They did not know who to choose. But at the time, no one ever mentioned Putin's name. And I would have been very surprised if they had. Not because I already had something against him, but simply because I knew nothing about him. He didn't make a scout out of him, so that's how he was regarded there, and he didn't get much respect.
Valentin Yumashov, Yeltsin's colleague and later his son-in-law, was considered the main patron of Putin's candidates for a successor, as well as oligarch Boris Berezovsky.
Putin is a controlled man. He cannot be an independent figure, Berezovsky believed. With the help of Tatiana Dyachenko and Valentin Yumashev, Berezovsky imposed this choice on Yeltsin. Yeltsin was already not quite adequate, not quite sane, and he succumbed to the compulsion of this group. They convinced him that this was a predictable, controlled, not really independent, provincial man.
Everything changed when Putin took office, but later about this. After all, the successor must first be somehow legalized in the eyes of society to make him a valuable and visible figure. The current government was even disbanded on August 9, 1999 for future dictator. On the same day, Yeltsin announced him as his successor.
Я решил назвать человека, который
I decided to name the person who is capable of consolidating society.
консолидировать общество. Это секретарь,
This is the Secretary of the Security Council,
директор ФСБ
Director of the Russian FSB,
Владимир
Putin.
Путин. Сегодня
Today,
я принял решение об отставке
I took the decision to dismiss
Сергея
the government of Sergei Stepashin.
Степашина. Я обратился в
I appealed to the State Duma with a request to approve
утвердить Владимира
Vladimir Putin as chairman of the Russian government.
должности председателя правительства России.
It is worth recalling that by the end of Yeltsin's reign, Russia was in crisis, depreciation of the ruble, declining production, hence unemployment, deterioration in living standards, and price increase. In all their troubles, Russians blamed President Yeltsin, and transferring the negative rating to his successor would have been a failure. The country needed a shock to see Putin as the savior from troubles. September the 18th, 1999. Surviving residents of a house on Guryanova Street in Moscow are saying goodbye to their home and their loves buried under the rubble of the demolished house.
I would like to see a monument erected on this place. It's supposed to be a place where houses will be built, but I think it's a sacrilege. You can't build houses here.
The survivors awaited a monument, but not the investigation of the tragedy that happened here a week earlier. On September the 9th, there was an explosion in the middle of the night. 2 entrances were destroyed and hundreds of people were killed. Terror and shock overwhelmed Russia. People patrolled outside their homes, checking anyone who aroused suspicion. They were afraid to sleep in their own apartments because every night could be someone's last. A few days later, on September the 13th, the same repeated by another address, Kashir Highway. 3 more days later, on September the 16th, a house in Volgodonsk exploded. More than 300 people were killed and almost 2,000 wounded as a result of terrorist attacks. The Kremlin officials called some Chechen terrorists guilty.
It's absolutely clear to us that terrorists are hiding on the territory of the Chechen Republic and are supported by extremist forces.
It should be noted that at that time the Russian leadership dreamt of revenge after the defeat in the First Russian-Chechen War. The example of Chechnya could serve as an impetus for other national autonomies in their quest for independence from Moscow. But the impoverished people who still remembered the grief of losses during the first campaign did not want to fight, and they were not particularly sympathetic to the Chechens either, and those attacks came in handy for a new war and a new regime.
We will pursue terrorists everywhere, at the airport, and rob them out in the outhouse.
It was this phrase that made Putin recognizable to the masses and guaranteed the presidency.
Any presidential campaign of this kind is good on the basis of some kind of threats. Well, since no one wanted to organize external threats to Russia, but they decided to turn such an internal threat into external one. That is, an attack by Chechen fighters on peaceful Russian cities. I don't know for sure whether it was Putin's improvisation to rob them out in the outhouse, but I quite admit that it was a political technological preparation.
On September the 30th, 1999, Russia attacked Chechnya, calling its invasion a counter-terrorist operation. Turning cities into ruins and killing civilians, Russia occupied an independent republic headed by the Kremlin subordinate Ahmad Kadyrov, the father of the current leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. The Russians, who were absorbed by the new war and the new grief, no longer remember the terrorist attacks. The tragedy only affected the survivors in September 1999, and the inconsistencies in the investigations were increasingly questioning the Kremlin's favorable theory of terror attacks. And quite seriously, so even Putin's associates suspected him of being involved in the tragedy.
After the explosions, a car driver in Ryazan noticed two people who were unloading bags near the entrance of the house. These bags turned out to be hexagen and an explosive device. After a very short time, they were detained in Ryazan, and it turned out that they were FSB employees.
Kremlin employees began to make excuses. However, they were themselves confused in their testimony. Reporting on the incident in the Kremlin, the former head of the Interior Ministry, Vladimir Rushailo, claimed that a terrible terrorist attack had been prevented. Head of the Federal Security Service, Nikolai Patrushev, called it a drill. They say the bags were filled with sugar and the vigilante citizens just were too careful.
Patrushev said we took it to the test site and tested it, and it was really sugar. If you conduct your own exercises, if you check it yourself, what did you go to test site to check? Did you put sugar or hexagen in it? In fact, there was a very significant other episode. When 3 days before the explosion of the house in Volgodonsk, Seleznyov, the Speaker of the State Duma, announced that a provocation was being prepared to blow up an apartment building in Volgodonsk. But the house in Moscow blew up, and 3 days later, the house in Volgodonsk blew up.
These inconsistencies outraged even the new regime servants.
You told us on Monday that the house in Volgodonsk was blown up 3 days before the explosion. This could be considered as a provocation, that the State Duma said that the house was blown up, but it was blown up on Thursday.
These inconsistencies and the demolishing of the house on the Guryanova street raised suspicions that Putin and his entourage, if they did not organize the bombings, were definitely their main beneficiaries.
I also cannot 100% say who organized these bombings either. Why? The answer to this question is absolutely obvious. Putin took advantage of it. Whether he organized it or not, he took advantage of what happened. And it didn't take a great mind to realize that these explosions inflamed the situation and frightened the Russian public. In general, the Chechen campaign, this war, in this case I rely on the opinion of experts, the war was created artificially. That is, there was no platform for such a confrontation. At that moment, everything was working for this campaign. For the campaign to transition Yeltsin's power from one form to another as effectively as possible.
Эффективного перехода ельцинской власти из одной формы в другую форму.
The Putin supporters may accuse me of a bias, saying that it was under Putin's leadership that Russia unleashed the war against Ukraine. Who else would I accuse of all the sins? But the facts are clear. Putin has never really cared much for Russians. The nuclear-powered cruiser Kursk is the owner of the Russian submarine fleet. If the submarine had been placed in the center of Moscow, it would occupy half of the Red Square. It sank on August the 12th, 2000, during exercises. The families of the submariners were begging for their husbands and children to be rescued. How long can this last? They're like in a tin can now. What did they arrest him for? Putin went to Sochi on holiday and didn't even think of ending it sooner. And while the future dictator was basking in the sun, the submariners spent 2 days begging for help, locked up in the Barents Sea.
The knocking from the 9th, it lasted until August 14th. 2.5 days.
Only 10 days after the tragedy on August the 22nd, the authorities recognized the submarine's demise and Putin met with the relatives of the deceased. At that time, people did not know that a man who sympathized to them had recently called them corrupt.
He called and said that Channel 1 hired the whores to discredit him.
Putin didn't show sympathy either for the victims or their relatives. Smiling, he answered the question, what happened to the Kursk submarine, by CNN host Larry King.
It sank.
The intimidation and disregard for people is the foundation on which Putin's regime is built. This has ensured Putin's second term and let him manipulate laws for future terms. For example, when Putin played a game of thimbles with Medvedev to circumvent legislative restrictions, and it seemed, here it was, the Russians' chance for a decent life. But Kremlin propaganda successfully sold the idea of bringing back the old days, and Russians voted for Putin again.
Just as Dmitry Medvedev's presidency faced difficult challenges for Russia. First of all, we should mention the mortgage crisis that occurred in 2008, which also hit the Russian Federation. And it also affected the economy, which alarmed the citizens of the Russian Federation, as we have said, and propaganda, all sorts of media, that only this way can Russia regain its former greatness and borders.
2 years later, during his third run for the presidency, Putin played the role of a land collector. Russian propaganda nurtured a sense of grandeur and imperialism in Russians. Russia occupied Crimea under the approval of an impoverished population. And started a war in Donbass.
They absolutely do not care that they do not have a well-established life, that they have an insufficient level of provision in the state, that they do not travel outside their cities, that they are actually at the level at which Russia lived back in the days of the Romanov dynasty and general secretaries. So in fact, we see that Russia is fueling the hatred of Russians by compensating for the problems that they have in the middle of that Russian state.
The annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin's top officials often used to raise Putin's constantly falling rating. A concert, a parade, a new bridge, and then a poor Russian forgets about empty pockets, lack of work, lack of prospects, and the future in general, and starts loving Putin again. Moreover, they start loving him so much that they forgive him the rewriting of the Constitution.
Все эти 1,5 месяца было много встреч с избирателями. Предложения были разные.
During this month and a half, there were many meetings with voters. There were different proposals. Some wanted Putin to stay. Some said a renewal was needed.
За новые лица. Но при этом
But at the same time, they had a reservation.
нужно, чтобы все-таки Путин, что называется,
It is necessary to keep Putin around. It is necessary to stipulate everything publicly or to remove restrictions limitations on the number of presidential terms in the Constitution.
По числу президентских сроков в Конституции.
Once again, the Kremlin's favorite technique. People are asking for it. The Putin regime has constantly imposed on Russians the desire to be subjects of a dictator, and people have forgotten that each election of Putin is a chance to change their lives, to choose another candidate to protest, to challenge rigged elections, and Russians have not used any of these chances. During the years of Putin's regime, the Kremlin has accustomed most citizens to the idea of a little man who does not decide anything and cannot influence, if not their life, then at least their death. Russians themselves are to blame for the fact that the Kremlin now decides how they will die, in the trenches in Ukraine, in a war unleashed by Russia itself, or in prison for daring to speak out against this war. Although the Kremlin really wants to keep Russians in blinkers, the ruling elite is still afraid of the people's anger. Therefore, before the elections, the population is fed with a sense of well-being in the country. They manually keep the ruble exchange rate, do not announce mobilization.
They have already obliged exporters to sell a significant part of their foreign currency earnings. They are trying to stabilize the situation on the currency market so that the dollar at least does not grow further. But of course, they will try to postpone mobilization. That is, if it doesn't come to the point where the front collapses right now, they will postpone it, because mobilization will hit loyalty extremely enormously.
Elections in Russia have never been transparent, and Putin's victories have never been fair. Sweep of the opposition, elimination of the independent observers, stuffing and manipulation. The Kremlin has already predetermined the outcome of the elections. It may seem that by repression, Putin has taken away the last levers of resistance from Russians. But in fact, Russian society has more opportunities than ever to overthrow the regime and have a chance for the future. It will not immediately become bright and perfect, but at least it will be possible. Prigozhin's mutiny showed how fragile the Kremlin is, and they may not withstand a second onslaught. Ksenia Barvinenko, specially for UATV.